Picture this. You're standing in the shadowed corridors of the Vatican in the year 1501, and the whispers that echo off these sacred walls would make even the most hardened sinner cross themselves in horror. The rumors speak of unholy unions, of a father who has violated every commandment of God and man, of siblings whose love has twisted into something so perverse that it defies the very foundations of Christian morality. At the center of these accusations stands a woman whose beauty was legendary, whose intelligence was feared, and whose name would become synonymous with corruption itself. Her golden hair catches the candlelight as she glides through the papal apartments, her silk gown rustling against marble floors that have witnessed centuries of prayer and now bear witness to something far darker. She is Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, sister to the ruthless Cesare Borgia, and according to the whispered accusations that spread like plague through Renaissance Italy, she is something else entirely. Something that should not exist in the house of God. The charges against her are so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that even speaking them aloud feels like blasphemy. They say she has been intimate with her own father, the vicar of Christ on earth. They claim her brother Cesare shares her bed with the casual frequency of a husband. They whisper that the children she bears carry the cursed blood of multiple fathers, all from within her own family, creating a web of incestuous corruption that reaches to the very throne of St. Peter. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. But here's what makes this story so particularly haunting. These weren't just idle rumors spread by political enemies. These accusations came from multiple sources, from different time periods, from people who had everything to lose by speaking such terrible truths about the most powerful family in Europe. Cardinals wrote secret letters detailing what they claimed to have witnessed. Ambassadors sent coded messages to their kings describing scenes that should never have occurred within the sacred walls of the Vatican. Even members of Lucrezia's own household staff, bound by oaths of loyalty and silence, somehow found ways to leak information about the unholy practices they observed behind closed doors. To understand how such monstrous accusations could even be conceived, you must first understand the world that created the Borgias. This was Renaissance Italy, a land where power was everything and morality was merely a tool to be wielded against one's enemies. The papal throne wasn't just a religious position, it was the ultimate political prize, controlling vast territories, enormous wealth, and the spiritual allegiance of millions across Europe. And in 1492, a Spanish cardinal named Rodrigo Borgia purchased that throne through the most brazen display of corruption the church had ever witnessed. He didn't just buy votes, he bought entire cardinals, offering them castles, bishoprics, and bags of gold so heavy it took multiple men to carry them. When the smoke cleared from the papal conclave, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, and with him came his children. Not just any children, but offspring he openly acknowledged, despite his supposed vow of celibacy. There was Juan, the golden son destined for military glory. There was Cesare, brilliant and ruthless, who would abandon his cardinal's robes for a sword. There was Geoffrey the youngest, often whispered to be the product of his mother's affair with another man entirely. And then there was Lucretia. Born in 1480, she entered the world already marked by scandal. Her father wasn't just any priest, he was a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, who had openly lived with multiple mistresses and fathered numerous children. Her mother, Vanozza de Catane, was a Roman noblewoman who had managed the impossible feat of maintaining Rodrigo's affections longer than any of his other lovers while simultaneously conducting her own affairs with other powerful men. But Lucrezia was different from her siblings from the very beginning. Where Juan was boisterous and Cesare was calculating, Lucrezia possessed an almost supernatural beauty combined with an intelligence that unnerved even the sophisticated courtiers of Rome. Contemporary accounts describe her as having hair like spun gold that reached nearly to her feet when unbound, skin so pale it seemed to glow in candlelight, and eyes that could shift from innocent blue to calculating gray depending on her mood. More disturbing than her physical beauty was the way she seemed to affect the men around her. Grown ambassadors would stumble over their words in her presence. Hardened soldiers would blush like schoolboys when she smiled at them. Even elderly cardinals, men who had dedicated their lives to God, would find excuses to linger in rooms where she was present, their eyes following her movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her father noticed this power she wielded, and he began to cultivate it deliberately. While other noble daughters of her era were taught embroidery and music, Lucrezia was given an education that would have impressed university scholars. She learned to speak Latin, Greek, French, and Spanish with perfect fluency. She studied philosophy, theology, and most dangerously, the art of statecraft. By the time she was 12, she could analyze political treaties with the skill of a seasoned diplomat and manipulate court politics with moves so subtle that her victims often didn't realize they'd been outmaneuvered until it was too late. But it was her relationship with her family that began to raise eyebrows among the more observant members of the papal court. The Borgias were always physically affectionate, touching and embracing in ways that made others uncomfortable. Rodrigo would kiss Lucrezia's lips in public with a lingering intensity that seemed inappropriate for a father. Cesare would drape his arm around his sister's waist during formal ceremonies, his hand resting just below her breast in a gesture that was supposed to be protective but looked possessive. The whispers began early, but they were dismissed as the jealous gossip of political enemies. After all, the Borgias were Spanish, and everyone knew that Spanish families were more demonstrative in their affections than the reserved Roman nobility. Besides, Rodrigo was now pope, and who would dare accuse the vicar of Christ of such unspeakable sins? The first serious accusations came in 1493 when Lucrezia was just 13 years old. A young priest named Don Bernardino, who served in the papal household, approached Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere with a story so shocking that the cardinal initially refused to believe it. Don Bernardino claimed that he had inadvertently witnessed Pope Alexander VI in his private chambers with his daughter Lucrezia in a state of undress, engaged in activities that were clearly not those of a normal father and daughter. Cardinal della Rovere was no friend to the Borgias, but even he hesitated to act on such an accusation. The political implications were staggering. If true, it would mean that the head of the Catholic Church was not only violating his vow of celibacy, but was committing incest with his own child. The scandal would rock Christianity to its foundations and provide ammunition for the growing Protestant movements that were already questioning papal authority. But Don Bernardino was insistent, and he wasn't the only one. Other members of the papal household began coming forward with their own disturbing observations. They spoke of strange sounds coming from the Pope's private apartments late at night. They described finding Lucrezia's jewelry and clothing in her father's chambers at inappropriate hours. Most damning of all, they reported conversations they had overheard between father and daughter that contained endearments and promises that no parent should ever make to their child. One chambermaid, a woman named Caterina, who had served the papal household for over 20 years, provided the most explicit testimony. She swore in the bones of St. Peter that she had entered the Pope's bedchamber one morning to find Lucrezia asleep beside her father, both of them naked beneath silk sheets. When she gasped in shock, Pope Alexander had simply smiled at her and said, "God's love takes many forms, dear Caterina. Who are we to question his design?" The testimony was compelling, but it came from servants, people whose word would never be accepted against that of the Pope in any formal proceeding. Cardinal della Rovere found himself in an impossible position. He had evidence of the most heinous crime imaginable, but no way to act on it without destroying the church itself. Then came the matter of Lucrezia's first marriage, and with it, evidence that the corruption within the Borgia family went even deeper than anyone had imagined. In 1493, when she was still just 13, Lucrezia was betrothed to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. It was a typical political alliance designed to strengthen ties between the Papal States and the powerful Sforza family of Milan. But from the very beginning, the marriage was troubled by the same whispers that had plagued Lucretia's relationship with her father. Giovanni Sforza was 26 when he married Lucretia, old enough to understand the political benefits of the alliance, but young enough to be genuinely attracted to his beautiful bride. By all accounts, he was initially infatuated with her, writing love letters that praised not just her beauty, but her intelligence and wit. He seemed determined to make their political marriage into a real romantic partnership. But something went wrong almost immediately after the wedding ceremony. Within weeks, Giovanni was writing different kinds of letters, messages filled with confusion and growing alarm. He complained that his wife seemed more interested in lengthy private conversations with her father than in spending time with her new husband. He noted that Lucrezia received mysterious visitors at all hours, including her brother Cesare, who would closet himself with her for hours at a time behind locked doors. Most disturbing of all, Giovanni began to suspect that his marriage was not being consummated naturally. In private letters to his cousin, he wrote that Lucrezia seemed to approach their marital bed with a clinical detachment that unnerved him. She would submit to his advances, but in a way that suggested she was merely performing a duty rather than participating in an act of love. More troubling still, she seemed to possess knowledge about intimate matters that no virgin bride should have had, responding to his touch with a practiced expertise that suggested extensive prior experience. The marriage deteriorated rapidly as Giovanni became increasingly paranoid about his wife's relationship with her family. He began to notice that Lucretia would disappear for days at a time, claiming to be visiting her father for important family discussions. When she returned from these visits, she would be withdrawn and distracted, as if her mind was still focused on whatever had transpired during her absence. The breaking point came in 1494, when Giovanni claimed to have discovered the true nature of the Borgia family's corruption. In a letter that would later be seized by papal agents and destroyed, he allegedly wrote to a trusted friend describing a scene that had left him physically ill. According to this account, Giovanni had returned unexpectedly to the papal apartments to find Lucrezia in a compromising position with both her father and her brother Cesare simultaneously. Whether this account was true or the product of Giovanni's increasingly unstable mental state, it marked the end of any pretense of a normal marriage. Pope Alexander VI, citing his son-in-law's obvious instability and his failure to properly consummate the marriage, began proceedings to have the union annulled. But Giovanni Sforza refused to go quietly. In a move that shocked all of Europe, he publicly accused the Pope of wanting the annulment so that he could continue his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Standing before a gathering of Roman nobles, Giovanni declared that Lucrezia had never been a proper wife to him because she was already married and all but named to her own father. He claimed that Pope Alexander VI kept his daughter for his own pleasure and had only arranged her marriage as a political convenience, never intending it to be consummated. The accusations sent shockwaves through the Christian world, but they also sealed Giovanni's fate. Within days of making his public statement, he fled Rome in fear for his life, leaving behind his wife and any claim to the Sforza alliance. His departure was taken by many as an admission that his accusations were false, the desperate lies of a man who couldn't accept his own failure as a husband. But for those who knew the Borgias well, Giovanni's flight looked less like cowardice and more like the desperate escape of a man who had discovered a terrible truth and realized that knowing it made him a dead man walking. With Giovanni Sforza's hasty departure from Rome, the papal court should have breathed a collective sigh of relief. The troublesome husband was gone, the scandalous accusations dismissed as the ravings of a jealous man, and Lucrezia was free to make a more advantageous marriage. But instead of quieting the rumors, Giovanni's flight only intensified them. His terror had been too genuine, his escape too desperate, for the whispers to simply fade away. More disturbing still was the way the Borgia family reacted to the crisis. Rather than maintaining a dignified silence or issuing formal denials, they seemed almost amused by the scandal. Pope Alexander VI continued his affectionate public displays with Lucretia, if anything becoming more demonstrative rather than less. During formal audiences, he would seat her beside him on a throne almost equal to his own, consulting with her on matters of state while his cardinals watched in uncomfortable silence. Cesare's behavior became even more troubling. As if to spite the rumors, he began accompanying his sister everywhere, his hand constantly at her elbow, his eyes never leaving her face even during the most important diplomatic meetings. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing the unsettling intensity of his gaze when it fell upon Lucretia, noting that he watched her with the jealous attention of a lover, rather than the protective concern of a brother. The annulment proceedings themselves provided additional fuel for the growing scandal. Under church law, a marriage could only be dissolved if it had never been properly consummated. This meant that Lucrezia would have to submit to a physical examination by papal physicians to prove her virginity had remained intact throughout her year of marriage. For most women of the era, such an examination would have been a humiliating ordeal, but contemporary accounts suggest that Lucretia approached it with an almost brazen confidence that shocked the medical experts involved. Dr. Gaspar Torella, the Pope's personal physician, conducted the examination in the presence of several witnesses, including representatives from the Sforza family who had demanded independent verification of the results. What he found defied explanation and would be whispered about in medical circles for decades to come. According to his sealed report, later discovered in Vatican archives, Lucretia's physical condition was consistent with virginity, but only in the most technical sense. The examination revealed evidence of intimate activity that had somehow avoided the traditional signs of consummation, suggesting a level of sexual knowledge and experience that seemed impossible for a sheltered noble daughter. More puzzling still were certain physical anomalies that Dr. Torella noted, but struggled to explain. He wrote of finding what appeared to be old scarring in areas that should have been untouched, marks that suggested repeated trauma followed by careful healing. Most disturbing of all, he discovered what he described as evidence of multiple different forms of intimate contact, some of which he admitted he had never encountered in his decades of medical practice. The physician's report was so unsettling that Pope Alexander VI ordered it sealed and hidden away, but not before copies had been made by various interested parties. Cardinals opposed to the Borgia papacy seized upon these medical findings as proof that something deeply unnatural was occurring within the papal household. They argued that no innocent virgin could possess the physical evidence of such varied and sophisticated intimate experiences while still technically maintaining her maidenhead. But the most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. Brother Antonio de Montesanto, a Dominican friar who served as confessor to several members of the papal household, approached Cardinal della Rovere with information that he claimed could no longer remain sealed by the sanctity of confession. The friar was clearly tormented by his decision to break the sacred bond between priest and penitent, but he insisted that the sins he had been asked to absolve were so monstrous that keeping silent would make him complicit in evil. According to Brother Antonio, multiple servants from the papal apartments had come to him seeking absolution for what they had witnessed. Their confessions painted a picture of systematic depravity that went far beyond the simple adultery that had initially been whispered about. They spoke of elaborate rituals conducted in the Pope's private chambers, ceremonies that combined religious symbolism with acts of such perversion that the friar struggled to repeat them even in the privacy of Cardinal della Rovere's study. The servants described finding specially constructed furniture in hidden rooms within the papal apartments, devices that seemed designed to facilitate acts that defied both nature and decency. They told of discovering correspondence between family members that contained explicit discussions of intimate encounters, letters that read more like the communications between experienced lovers than the normal exchanges between father and daughter or brother and sister. Most chilling of all, they reported overhearing conversations that suggested these activities were not random acts of passion, but carefully orchestrated performances designed to serve some larger purpose. The servants claimed that Lucrezia would sometimes emerge from these encounters with detailed instructions about how to behave with foreign dignitaries or what information to extract from visiting nobles, as if her intimate services were being used as tools of espionage and political manipulation. Brother Antonio's testimony was particularly credible because he had no apparent motive for fabricating such elaborate lies. As a Dominican friar, he had no political ambitions that would be served by destroying the Borgias. If anything, making such accusations put his own life in grave danger. Yet he persisted in his claims, providing details so specific and disturbing that even Cardinal della Rovere found himself believing the unbelievable. The friar described confessions that revealed a household where the normal boundaries between family members had been systematically erased. Servants spoke of witnessing Pope Alexander VI treating his daughter not as a child to be protected, but as a possession to be displayed and utilized. They described seeing Cesare exercise a proprietary control over Lucretia that went far beyond brotherly concern, making decisions about her clothing, her companions, and even her diet with the authority of a husband rather than a sibling. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of how Lucretia herself seemed to have adapted to this twisted dynamic. Rather than appearing as a victim of abuse, she was described as an active participant who had learned to wield her sexuality as a weapon. Servants told of overhearing her discussing political strategies with her father and brother, conversations where intimate favors were openly traded for political advantages. The pattern that emerged from these testimonies was one of a family that had created its own moral universe, where the normal rules of human behavior had been suspended in service of their insatiable hunger for power. Within the walls of the Vatican, acts that would have been condemned as abominations anywhere else had become routine transactions in the complex economy of Borgia ambition. As 1495 dawned, the weight of these accumulated testimonies began to create serious problems for Pope Alexander II's papacy. Several cardinals had approached him privately, demanding explanations for the rumors that continued to swirl around his family. Foreign monarchs were beginning to question whether they could maintain diplomatic relations with a pope whose personal conduct had become the subject of such scandalous speculation. Most dangerously of all, the growing Protestant movements in Northern Europe were seizing upon the Borgia scandals as evidence that the Catholic Church had become irredeemably corrupt. Martin Luther's followers distributed pamphlets throughout Germany depicting Pope Alexander VI as a figure of pure evil, using the accusations of incest as proof that the papacy itself had been taken over by Satan. Under this mounting pressure, Alexander VI made a decision that would prove to be a fatal mistake. Rather than addressing the rumors directly or attempting to reform his family's behavior, he chose to eliminate the sources of the most damaging testimony. It began subtly with servants who had spoken too freely about what they had witnessed, simply disappearing from the papal household. Some were reassigned to distant monasteries, others were given generous pensions and sent away from Rome, and a few simply vanished entirely, their fates unknown. Brother Antonio de Montesanto was found dead in his cell one morning, apparently having suffered a sudden heart attack despite being a healthy man in his 40s. Dr. Gaspar Torreya, the physician who had conducted Lucrezia's examination, died under mysterious circumstances during a visit to Naples, his medical notes conveniently destroyed in a fire that consumed his lodgings. One by one, the most credible witnesses to the Borgia family's alleged crimes were silenced, but their elimination only added weight to the accusations rather than dispelling them. Each suspicious death became additional evidence that the rumors must be true. For why else would the Pope go to such lengths to silence those who claimed to have witnessed his family's corruption? The campaign of intimidation and elimination reached its peak with the fate of Cardinal Giovanni Michel, the Venetian prelate who had been most vocal in demanding an investigation into the Borgia scandals. Michel had used his position as dean of the Sacred College to gather testimonies from across Europe, compiling what he claimed was irrefutable evidence of the papal family's crimes. In December 1495, Cardinal Michel was found dead in his chambers, his body bearing signs of poisoning that the papal physicians claimed were consistent with natural illness, but which independent experts identified as the effects of a rare toxin known to be favored by professional assassins. His death sent a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to challenge the Borgias. The price of opposition was death, but the elimination of witnesses created a new problem for Pope Alexander VI. The very extremity of his response had transformed what might have remained localized Roman gossip into an international scandal. Courts across Europe buzzed with speculation about what the Pope was so desperate to hide, and the systematic silencing of accusers began to look like confirmation of their most outrageous claims. The crisis deepened when foreign intelligence networks began taking serious interest in the Borgia scandals. The French court, always eager to find leverage against papal power, dispatched secret agents to Rome with orders to gather concrete evidence of the family's alleged crimes. These spies weren't interested in idle gossip. They wanted documentation that could be used to destroy the Pope's authority and potentially install a more compliant pontiff. What they discovered exceeded even their most cynical expectations. Through a network of bribed servants and corrupted officials, French agents gained access to private correspondence that revealed the true scope of the Borgia family's dysfunction. Letters between Lucrezia and her father contained endearments that no daughter should ever write to her parent, while communications between the siblings displayed an intimacy that crossed every boundary of appropriate familial affection. One particular letter, intercepted by French spies in early 1496, became legendary among European intelligence circles for its explicit content. Written in Lucrezia's own hand to her brother Cesare while he was campaigning in the Romagna, it contained passages so shocking that even hardened diplomatic agents struggled to believe what they were reading. The letter spoke of longing for his return in terms that were unmistakably sexual, describing specific acts they had shared and promising new pleasures when they were reunited. More damaging still were references to their father's involvement in these encounters. Lucrezia wrote casually about times when all three of them had been together, describing these occasions with the fond nostalgia of shared family memories rather than the horror such activities should have inspired. She even made jokes about their unusual arrangement, referring to herself as the bridge between her father and brother, the vessel through which their love for each other could be expressed. The French agents who first read these letters reportedly required several glasses of wine before they could continue their work. Here was documentary evidence of incest so systematic and casual that it suggested the Borgias had created their own moral universe, where such acts were not just acceptable but celebrated. The implications went far beyond mere scandal. This was evidence of a papal family that had abandoned every principle of Christian morality while claiming to represent God on earth. But the intelligence value of these letters was matched by their danger. The French court realized that possessing such explosive material made them targets for Borgia assassination attempts. The letters were quickly copied and distributed to multiple secure locations across Europe, ensuring that their contents would survive even if the original holders met untimely ends. Meanwhile, within the Vatican itself, the atmosphere had become suffocating with paranoia and fear. Pope Alexander VI trusted no one completely, not even his own children. He began rotating his personal guard daily, convinced that any long-term arrangement would give potential assassins time to corrupt his protectors. Food tasters were employed not just for the papal table, but for every member of the Borgia family, as rumors of poison plots multiplied with each passing week. Lucrezia found herself at the center of this web of suspicion and protection. Her daily routine became a carefully choreographed performance designed to prevent any repeat of the intelligence breaches that had proven so damaging to her family's reputation. She could no longer write personal letters without having them reviewed by papal censors. Her conversations were monitored by agents loyal to her father. Even her prayers were observed to ensure she wasn't passing coded messages to potential enemies. The psychological toll of this surveillance began to show in her behavior. Court observers noted that Lucrezia had developed nervous habits, constantly looking over her shoulder, startling at unexpected sounds, and speaking in whispers even during casual conversations. The confident young woman who had once dominated Roman social circles became increasingly withdrawn, appearing in public only when absolutely necessary and maintaining a guarded demeanor that suggested she trusted no one completely. Her relationship with Cesare became even more intense during this period, as if the external pressure had driven the siblings to depend on each other more completely. They were often seen walking together in the papal gardens, their heads close together in animated conversation, their body language suggesting an intimacy that made observers uncomfortable. When forced to attend separate functions, they would exchange meaningful glances across crowded rooms, communicating through a private language of looks and gestures that excluded everyone else. The most disturbing aspect of their relationship was how normal it had become to them. Servants reported overhearing conversations between the siblings that treated their unusual bond as the most natural thing in the world. They would discuss their intimate encounters with the casual ease of a married couple, making plans for future rendezvous with the practical efficiency of experienced lovers arranging their schedules. This normalization of the abnormal extended to their interactions with Pope Alexander II as well. The three of them had developed a family dynamic where boundaries that should have been absolute had been completely erased. They would share meals where conversation flowed easily between political strategy and intimate plans, where discussions of military campaigns were interrupted by affectionate touches that crossed every line of appropriate family behavior. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these family interactions wrote home describing scenes that defied their understanding of human relationships. They observed a father who caressed his daughter's face while discussing marriage alliances for her, his touch lingering in ways that suggested ownership rather than paternal love. They saw siblings who communicated through intimate gestures that spoke of shared secrets, too dark for others to comprehend. The Spanish ambassador, Juan de Vera, provided perhaps the most detailed account of the Borgia family's disturbing dynamics in a secret report sent to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1496. De Vera described attending a private dinner at the papal apartments where he witnessed interactions that left him questioning his own sanity. According to his account, Pope Alexander VI spent the evening alternately discussing church policy and making suggestive comments about his daughter's beauty, at one point actually reaching across the table to adjust her bodice in a manner that was shockingly inappropriate for any father, let alone the Pope. Cesare's behavior during this same dinner was equally unsettling. De Vera reported that the young man seemed to view his sister as personal property, correcting her statements, choosing her food for her, and even wiping wine from her lips with his own napkin in a gesture that was far too intimate for siblings. Most disturbing of all, neither Lucrezia nor her father seemed to find anything unusual about this possessive behavior, accepting it as the natural order of their family relationships. The ambassador's report included details so specific and shocking that King Ferdinand initially refused to believe them, assuming that de Vera had misunderstood what he was witnessing due to cultural differences or language barriers. But when similar reports began arriving from other diplomatic sources, the Spanish monarchs were forced to confront the horrifying possibility that the rumors about the Borgias were not just politically motivated slander, but accurate descriptions of unprecedented papal corruption. The international scandal reached new heights when copies of the French intelligence reports began circulating among European courts. These documents, which included not just intercepted letters but detailed testimonies from Borgia household staff, painted a picture of systematic depravity that shocked even the most cynical political observers. The evidence suggested that the papal apartments had become a center of organized vice, where the normal rules of Christian morality had been suspended in favor of a twisted family dynamic that served both personal pleasure and political advantage. Perhaps most damaging were testimonies that described how the Borgias used their intimate relationships as tools of statecraft. According to these accounts, Lucrezia's encounters with her father and brother were not just expressions of perverted desire, but carefully orchestrated performances designed to cement their political alliance. The family had apparently discovered that their shared transgression created a bond of mutual culpability that made betrayal impossible. None of them could expose the others without destroying themselves. This instrumentalization of incest as a political strategy represented a level of calculated evil that went far beyond simple moral weakness. It suggested that the Borgias had consciously chosen to violate the most fundamental taboos of Christian civilization, not in moments of uncontrolled passion, but as deliberate acts of policy designed to strengthen their hold on power. The evidence also revealed how this dynamic affected their relationships with outsiders. Both Lucrezia's failed marriage to Giovanni Sforza and her interactions with other potential suitors were apparently sabotaged by her inability to form normal, intimate bonds with anyone outside her immediate family. She had become so conditioned to the twisted dynamics of Borgia relationships that conventional romantic partnerships had become psychologically impossible for her. This psychological damage extended beyond personal relationships to affect her role as a political actor. Foreign diplomats reported that Lucrezia seemed incapable of forming genuine alliances with anyone who wasn't already compromised by their own moral failings. She appeared most comfortable with individuals who had their own dark secrets, as if she could only trust people who shared her experience of living outside the boundaries of normal human behavior. The cumulative weight of this evidence began to create serious problems for Catholic unity across Europe. Protestant reformers seized upon the Borgia scandals as proof that the Roman Church had become irredeemably corrupt, using the accusations of papal incest to justify their break with Catholic authority. Even loyal Catholic monarchs found themselves questioning whether they could continue to recognize the spiritual authority of a pope whose personal conduct had become the subject of such widespread and detailed accusations. The crisis deepened when several German bishops announced that they could no longer, in good conscience, recognize Pope Alexander II's authority over their dioceses. While they stopped short of formally breaking with Rome, their public statements questioning the Pope's moral fitness to lead the Church created a dangerous precedent that threatened to fragment Catholic unity just as Protestant movements were gaining strength across Northern Europe. In response to this mounting pressure, Pope Alexander VI made yet another catastrophic decision. Rather than attempting to reform his family's behavior or address the accusations directly, he chose to escalate his campaign of intimidation and elimination. The disappearances and mysterious deaths that had already claimed dozens of potential witnesses were expanded into a systematic purge designed to eliminate anyone who might possess compromising information about the Borgia family. This campaign of terror reached its peak in the spring of 1497, when a coordinated series of assassinations eliminated several key figures who had been gathering evidence against the papal family. The victims included two cardinals, a Venetian diplomat, and a prominent Roman banker who had been financing investigations into Borgia corruption. Each death was carefully staged to appear natural or accidental, but the timing and pattern made the true cause obvious to anyone paying attention. The elimination of these witnesses had the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than ending speculation about Borgia crimes, the obvious nature of the assassinations convinced many observers that the accusations must be true. The very extremity of the Pope's response suggested guilt rather than innocence, transforming what might have remained Roman gossip into a European crisis of faith. As news of the systematic murders spread across the continent, Catholic authorities found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. How could they maintain the fiction of papal infallibility when the Pope himself appeared to be orchestrating a campaign of murder to cover up his family's crimes? How could they preach Christian morality when the head of their church was credibly accused of the most fundamental violations of God's law? The answer, for many church leaders, was to distance themselves from the Borgias while maintaining the institutional authority of the papacy itself. A subtle campaign began to emerge, one that sought to isolate Pope Alexander II and his family while preserving the broader structure of Catholic power. Cardinals who had once competed for papal favor began meeting in secret to discuss the possibility of forcing Alexander's abdication or even declaring his election invalid due to the corruption that had surrounded it. But the Borgias were not passive victims of this ecclesiastical conspiracy. As pressure mounted against them, they began to reveal just how dangerous they could be when cornered. The family that had already demonstrated its willingness to commit incest and murder to maintain power was preparing to show the world that there were no depths to which they would not sink in their fight for survival. The turning point came in June 1497 with an event so shocking that it would forever cement the Borgia family's reputation for monstrous evil. Juan Borgia, the Pope's eldest son and Lucrezia's beloved brother, was found floating in the Tiber River with his throat cut and his body bearing the marks of systematic torture. The official story claimed he had been murdered by political enemies, but those closest to the papal family whispered a far darker truth. Juan had reportedly grown uncomfortable with the twisted dynamics that governed his family's relationships. Unlike Cesare, who seemed to revel in the perverse bond he shared with his sister, Juan had begun to question whether their behavior was sustainable. More dangerously still, he had started making comments to trusted friends about the need to protect Lucretia from what he called the corrupting influence of their father and brother. The night of his death, Juan had attended a family dinner at the papal apartments, a gathering that witnesses described as unusually tense. Servants reported overhearing heated arguments between Juan and Cesare, with their sister's name mentioned repeatedly in voices too low to make out specific words. What they could observe was Juan's obvious distress and Cesare's cold, calculating responses to whatever concerns his brother was raising. When Juan's body was discovered, the pattern of wounds told a story that went far beyond a simple political assassination. The torture marks suggested someone had taken considerable time and effort to inflict maximum pain before delivering the final blow. More disturbing still, certain aspects of the mutilation seemed almost ritualistic, as if Juan's death had been designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging the family's twisted unity. Cesare's reaction to his brother's murder was perhaps the most telling evidence of what had really occurred. Rather than displaying the grief expected of a bereaved sibling, he seemed almost relieved by Juan's death. Within days of the funeral, he had moved to claim his dead brother's titles and properties, acting with an efficiency that suggested he had been planning for this transition long before Juan's body was pulled from the river. Even more shocking was how the murder affected the relationship between Cesare and Lucrezia. Rather than drawing apart in their shared grief, the surviving siblings seemed to become even more intensely bonded. They were now inseparable, moving through the papal court like two halves of a single entity, their intimacy so obvious that even the most diplomatic observers found it impossible to ignore. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing scenes that defied comprehension. They observed Cesare and Lucrezia holding whispered conversations during church services, their heads so close together that their breath mingled as they spoke. They witnessed the siblings sharing food from the same plate during formal banquets, their fingers touching as they reached for the same morsel, in gestures that seemed designed to communicate their bond to everyone watching. Most disturbing of all was how Pope Alexander VI responded to his son's death. Rather than launching a genuine investigation into the murder, he seemed content to let the matter fade into obscurity. His grief appeared performative, displayed for public consumption, but lacking the devastating anguish that should have consumed a father who had lost his child. Instead, he seemed almost energized by the tragedy, as if Juan's elimination had removed an obstacle to some larger plan. The Pope's behavior became even more erratic in the months following Juan's death. His public appearances with Lucrezia took on an almost manic quality, as if he was determined to display their relationship with unprecedented boldness. During formal audiences, he would seat her so close to his throne that their bodies touched, his hand resting on her knee or shoulder in gestures that made visiting dignitaries shift uncomfortably in their seats. The whispers that had once been confined to dark corners of the Vatican now echoed openly through the halls of power across Europe. Cardinals who had once been careful to speak only in coded language began making explicit accusations about the papal family's crimes. The death of Juan had apparently convinced many observers that the Borgias were capable of any atrocity, including fratricide, in service of their twisted desires. Brother Francesco di Narnese, a Franciscan monk who had served as Juan's confessor, provided the most damning testimony about the family's reaction to the murder. According to his account, Lucrezia had come to him seeking absolution for what she called her role in her brother's death. Through tears that seemed genuine, she confessed that Juan had threatened to expose the true nature of her relationships with their father and surviving brother, forcing them to choose between family loyalty and his continued existence. The monk's testimony suggested that Juan's murder had been a collective family decision, reached after careful deliberation about the threat he posed to their continued power. According to Lucrezia's confession, they had tried to convince Juan to remain silent about what he knew, offering him increased wealth and authority in exchange for his complicity. When he refused and threatened to take his concerns to hostile cardinals, they concluded that his death was the only solution that would preserve their secret. What made this confession particularly chilling was how Lucrezia described her own role in luring Juan to his death. She admitted to using their sibling bond to convince him to meet with Cesare alone, knowing that this encounter would likely be his last. Her tears during the confession seemed to stem not from guilt about the murder itself, but from sadness that Juan had forced them to destroy him through his stubborn refusal to accept their family's unique dynamic. Brother Francesco was so disturbed by this confession that he immediately sought guidance from his superiors about whether the seal of confession could be broken in cases involving such monstrous crimes. The Franciscan leadership, already deeply concerned about the Borgia scandals, advised him to maintain silence but to document everything in sealed letters that could be opened if he met an untimely death. These precautions proved wise when Brother Francesco was found dead in his cell just 3 weeks after hearing Lucrezia's confession. His death was attributed to a sudden illness, but the timing convinced many observers that the Borgias had once again eliminated a dangerous witness. The sealed letters he had prepared were discovered and secretly copied by Franciscan leadership before being turned over to papal authorities, ensuring that his testimony would survive even if the originals were destroyed. The monk's documentation of Lucrezia's confession provided the most explicit evidence yet of the Borgia family's systematic criminality. His careful notes revealed not just the fact of their incestuous relationships, but the calculated nature of their approach to maintaining power through the most heinous means imaginable. They had apparently convinced themselves that their unique circumstances justified any action, no matter how evil, if it served to preserve their position. As 1498 dawned, the accumulated weight of evidence against the Borgia family had created a crisis that threatened to tear the Catholic Church apart. Protestant reformers across Northern Europe were distributing pamphlets that used the papal scandals to justify their break with Roman authority. Even loyal Catholic monarchs found themselves questioning whether they could maintain diplomatic relations with a pope whose family had become synonymous with every form of moral corruption. The French court, which had been accumulating intelligence on the Borgias for years, finally decided to act on their evidence. King Louis XIV dispatched a formal embassy to Rome with secret instructions to present Pope Alexander VI with an ultimatum: reform his family's behavior and submit to church investigation, or face the withdrawal of French support for papal authority. The threat was particularly dangerous because French military power was essential to maintaining papal control over the turbulent Italian peninsula. But the Borgias responded to this pressure in characteristic fashion, with a combination of violence and calculated manipulation that demonstrated their complete rejection of normal moral constraints. Rather than submitting to outside investigation, they intensified their campaign of intimidation while simultaneously working to compromise their critics through blackmail and bribery. The French ambassador who delivered King Louis's ultimatum was found dead in his lodgings just 2 days after his audience with the Pope. His death was attributed to a fever, but French intelligence agents who examined the body reported finding evidence of poisoning by a substance so rare and sophisticated that it could only have been obtained through the most exclusive criminal networks. The murder of a French ambassador represented an unprecedented escalation in the Borgia family's war against their critics. It demonstrated their willingness to risk international conflict rather than submit to any external authority that might expose their crimes. More importantly, it revealed how completely they had abandoned any pretense of operating within the bounds of civilized behavior. Pope Alexander VI's response to French protests about their ambassador's death was perhaps even more shocking than the murder itself. Rather than expressing regret or offering to investigate the incident, he suggested that the ambassador's death was divine punishment for his presumption in questioning papal authority. The Pope seemed to be claiming that God himself had struck down anyone who dared to challenge the Borgia family's right to operate above human law. This blasphemous interpretation of his critic's death represented the final stage in Alexander VI's psychological break with reality. He had apparently convinced himself that his family's crimes were not violations of God's law, but expressions of divine will. In his twisted worldview, their incestuous relationships and murderous conspiracies were sacred acts that ordinary mortals were too limited to understand. Lucrezia and Cesare seemed to share their father's delusional sense of divine mission. Contemporary accounts describe the siblings discussing their intimate relationship in almost mystical terms, as if their bond transcended normal human categories of right and wrong. They spoke of their love as a spiritual force that connected them to higher truths, unavailable to lesser beings, transforming their crimes into sacraments in their private religion of power and pleasure. This messianic delusion made the Borgias even more dangerous because it eliminated their last connection to conventional morality. They no longer saw themselves as human beings who had chosen evil, but as divine instruments whose actions were justified by their unique nature. This psychological transformation made them capable of any atrocity, because they had convinced themselves that normal rules simply didn't apply to beings of their elevated status. The final act of this tragedy began to unfold in 1503, when Pope Alexander VI fell seriously ill during the hot Roman summer. The official diagnosis was malaria, but rumors immediately began circulating that the Pope had been poisoned by enemies who had finally found a way to penetrate his elaborate security arrangements. More sinister whispers suggested that his own children had decided he had become a liability to their continued survival. As Alexander VI lay dying in his papal apartments, the full scope of the Borgia family's corruption was finally revealed to the world. Cardinals who had been terrorized into silence for years began speaking openly about what they had witnessed during the family's reign of terror. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports home describing scenes of depravity that had been conducted within the sacred walls of the Vatican itself. The testimony that emerged during those final days painted a picture of systematic evil that exceeded even the most lurid rumors that had circulated about the family. Witnesses described elaborate rituals conducted in hidden chambers beneath the papal apartments, ceremonies that combined religious symbolism with acts of such perversion that many observers struggled to find words to describe them. Most shocking of all were revelations about how the family had used their crimes as tools of political control. They had apparently discovered that involving others in their depraved activities created bonds of mutual culpability that could be exploited for political advantage. Cardinals, diplomats, and even foreign monarchs had been drawn into compromising situations that made them vulnerable to Borgia blackmail. The intelligence networks that had been documenting Borgia crimes for years finally felt safe enough to reveal their evidence publicly. Documents were produced showing systematic patterns of incest, murder, and corruption that had operated at the highest levels of church authority. Letters in the family's own handwriting described their crimes with a casual brutality that shocked even hardened political observers. When Pope Alexander VI finally died on August 18, 1503, his passing was greeted not with the mourning traditionally accorded to a papal death, but with expressions of relief from across the Christian world. Church bells that should have tolled in sorrow instead seemed to ring with celebration, as if the entire Catholic community was exhaling after holding its breath throughout the nightmare of Borgia rule. Lucrezia's reaction to her father's death was perhaps the most revealing glimpse into her true character that history would ever record. Rather than displaying the grief expected of a devoted daughter, she seemed primarily concerned with securing her own survival in a world where the protection of papal authority could no longer shield her from the consequences of her crimes. Within hours of Alexander VI's death, she had begun burning documents and destroying evidence that might be used against her by the new papal administration. Servants reported seeing her feeding papers into fires with desperate efficiency, as if she was trying to erase the documentary evidence of an entire lifetime of systematic evil. But the evidence of the Borgia family's crimes had spread too widely to be contained by the destruction of a few documents. Copies of their incriminating correspondence existed in intelligence archives across Europe, and witnesses to their depravity had already provided detailed testimonies to church authorities and foreign governments. Cesare's fate was sealed even more quickly than his sister's. Without the protection of papal authority, his enemies moved swiftly to settle accounts for years of terror and murder. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually died in exile, his body bearing the marks of violence that suggested his end had been neither quick nor merciful. Lucrezia survived longer, protected by her gender and her marriage to a powerful noble family that could provide some measure of security. But she never escaped the shadow of her family's crimes, spending her remaining years as a virtual prisoner of her own reputation, shunned by respectable society and haunted by memories of the monstrous acts that had defined her youth. The Borgia scandals left permanent scars on the Catholic Church and provided ammunition for Protestant reformers that would be used for centuries to justify their break with Roman authority. The accusations of papal incest became a standard element in anti-Catholic propaganda, a symbol of the moral corruption that allegedly infected the highest levels of church hierarchy. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Borgia family's crimes was the demonstration of how completely power could corrupt even those who claimed to represent divine authority on earth. Their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power combined with moral weakness, showing how quickly the sacred could be transformed into the profane when human appetites were allowed to override divine law. The whispers that began in the shadowed corridors of the Vatican in 1501 had grown into a roar that would echo through history, carrying with them the names of Lucretia, Cesare, and Alexander II as symbols of humanity's capacity for evil. Their crimes would be remembered not just as historical scandals, but as warnings about what happens when power is exercised without conscience, and when the most sacred trusts are betrayed by those sworn to uphold them. In the end, the golden haired woman who had once glided through papal apartments in silk and jewels became a cautionary figure whose very name evoked images of corruption and depravity. Lucrezia Borgia's story serves as an eternal reminder that beauty, intelligence, and power mean nothing without moral foundation, and that even the most elevated positions in human society cannot protect those who choose evil from the ultimate judgment of history.